and welcome to the Law Deals podcast, where we discuss law firm succession plans, profitable law partnerships, and law firm purchases and sales. I'm your host, Ed Alexander. I've practiced transactional business law for 30 years, have my own practice, Alexander Business Law, and am a principal with Fitzgibbon Alexander, a business intermediary firm. We're on a mission to make sales of law firms commonplace so you can enjoy your practice and your life. In today's episode, I'm talking to Jonathan Hawkins, an attorney in Atlanta, Georgia. Jonathan, you and I know each other from the GLM Summit, the GLM Mastermind. We have similar practices, and I'm really happy to have you on the show today.
Ed, thanks for having me. I like what you've been doing on your podcast. I like sort of the information you're putting out there. I think lawyers need to hear it. So thanks for doing it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, so please introduce yourself to our audience.
Sure. I'm a lawyer here in Atlanta, founder of a firm called Law Firm GC, and we represent lawyers and law firms. Describe it as outside general counsel, but the other way I describe it is from formation to dissolution and everything in between. So that we have a business aspects, litigation aspect, ethics aspect, and risk management. Excellent.
How long have you been a lawyer?
Oh, goodness. Let's see. I graduated law school about 21 years ago. So,
wow. Nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So tell us about your journey. How did you come to where you are today?
Well, my dad, growing up, he was a lawyer. He's mostly retired now. And I did not want to be a lawyer. I just didn't want to do it. I wanted to do my own thing, which is funny when I tell you what ended up happening. So my dad was an engineer, and then went to law school. He went to Georgia Tech. So I ended up going to Georgia Tech for an engineering degree. My granddad went to Georgia Tech for an engineering degree. My granddad was not a lawyer, but it's sort of like it may have been my destiny to be a lawyer. I don't know. But I do remember in undergrad, I knew I did not want to be an engineer before I graduated, but I just needed to finish. I remember going to the career services and took all those assessments. I mean, all sorts of personality tests, assessments, and it spits back out sort of the top 10 careers that it says were perfect for me. And 5 of the 10 were different types of lawyer. And I was like, I don't believe it, but here I am.
It's sucked into the black hole, right?
Yeah.
You can't get away from it. Well, I tell the story about my kids, right? So when they were young, they would tell me, Dad, I never want to be a lawyer. You have the most boring job in the world. All you do is sit in front of a screen all day and type. And now one of them is a lawyer and one of them is a doctor, but they both sit in front of a screen and type all day.
That's right. That's what we all do, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you go to law school, you graduate, and tell me about your first jobs before you opened your firm.
Yeah, so I was fortunate. I was able to clerk for a federal judge down in Savannah right out of law school. So I did that, trial judge. So I did that for a year, which was a cool experience. It was sort of a good in between sort of the academic side, sort of slowly working your way into the practical side of practicing law. Although when you're in the chambers, you only see sort of one side of what lawyers do, and that's the filing of papers and the motions and then going to court. You don't see all the stuff that happens outside of that context. But so did that for a year, then moved back to Atlanta and worked for a med-mal defense firm for about 1.5 years, which was a great experience. It's a fun place, had a lot of cool folks that were working there, a lot of friends there. Got to do all sorts of, depositions and trials very quickly. And there were complicated cases, but I really did not like the medicine at all. There was one case, I'll tell this story. There was one case, I took over the case for another lawyer that left, but it was a pulmonary embolism case. And so I was flying around the country doing expert depositions and hearing about all the symptoms of this pulmonary embolism, and you get shortness of breath and all these things happen. And just for like a whole month, that's all I was doing was going to the expert depositions. And I started to have symptoms. I was convinced myself I had a pulmonary embolism. I mean, I was so convinced, my wife now, but who was not my wife then, she was in town. And I was so worked up. I convinced her to take me to the emergency room. We go there, and by the time, you got to wait for a long time. By the time I get back there, all my symptoms went away. The ER doc looks at me and he's like, "Are you crazy?" It's like, "What in the world?" Basically, are you crazy? Okay. So then I leave there and completely embarrassed. Fast forward about 8 months, and we go to trial in this case for the pulmonary embolism case. And not my client, but one of the other defendants was that ER doc that saw me.
Oh, that's hilarious.
It was a weird case. It was some sort of thing that came out of the person's eye. I mean, it was the most bizarre case. So it really had nothing to do with ER. Anyway, I ran away from MedMal after that, switched firms, started doing business litigation.
Gotcha. Okay. So then you're doing business litigation. How do you then merge into the law firm side of things?
So yeah, that's an interesting story. So I started out doing a lot of real estate litigation. Then I started doing business divorce cases, closely held businesses. I was doing a lot of that. And then my dad, who was practicing down in Mobile, he, in the span of maybe 3 years, had done like 5 law firm breakup cases. And we were talking, he's like, I'm doing all these cases down here. There's got to be tons of these in Atlanta. It's got to be. Like, you're already doing business divorces. You should just take a look. And so I just started looking around to see if anybody in town did that. And I could not find anybody that said, this is what I do. Clearly, there were people that did it, but they did not go out there and, put the flag in the ground and said, this is what I do.
You just did it part of a general litigation practice, I guess. Yeah, commercial litigation.
Correct. And so I went out, I said, I'm going to do it. And I went and bought 3 thick, 4-inch thick treatises, read them cover to cover, all in my spare time while I'm practicing law as an associate. Started pulling law review articles, smaller books, case law. I started reading it and I said, I'm going to write a book on this for Georgia. And so I spent, a year and a half trying to write this thing. People thought I was crazy. My wife did. And then I was just going to lunch and talking to people about it. I started doing some work pro bono for some friends. And then it just sort of happened. There was no one there to mentor me in that practice area. I just sort of willed it into existence.
Well, as you know, from the business divorce realm, there is almost as bad as family law matters, right? Because every business is a marriage. It's just a marriage without the emotional, well, it does have an emotional component, but a different type of emotional component, right? And doing that kind of work and seeing those owners get so mad at one another. We were working on a dissolution of business, a breakup, not of a law firm, but just a general business. And, the other side was represented. We represented one of the partners, and we're sitting around a table trying to settle the matter. And so the 2 partners get up and leave. They don't go anywhere near each other. And the other attorney turns to me and goes, listen, did your client sleep with my wife or something? These guys just hate each other. So it's crazy, just crazy. But
yes, I've seen that where you're like, what part of the story have I not heard? There's got to be something for them to hate each other so much.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This bad. Yeah, right. Exactly. So yeah, I look at your firm, I guess, in that way. It's almost like from a prenup all the way through to the divorce, right? Except just in a law firm context. So that's great. Now you also, I saw on your website, you have the law firm dissolution reporter. So tell us about that.
Yes, that's sort of a new initiative that we're launching. I've done a lot of these cases. I've read a lot of these cases from all over the country. So I've set that up on our website. We're going to start posting articles about all the cases that pop up and as they come up. So there aren't that many of them. I mean, really, I've been tracking them sort of nationwide. You got them in the big states. There's probably a good many in Florida, New York, California, decent number in Texas, maybe Illinois too. But mostly you got to pull from all over the country to sort of get the case law. So that's what we're doing.
So I don't know if you did this when you wrote your book, but I found that the actual reported cases of business breakups were the best source of really good stories to put into the book. I mean, there are just some that you go, wow, that person was incredibly creative in the way that they tried to rip off their partner, and just amazing. I'm sure you have the same thing.
Yeah. That's where you get your good war stories. And when they're other people's cases, I can talk about them freely instead of my own, where I really can't talk about them, right?
Exactly. Right, right. That's the beauty of it. Those reported decisions are wonderful. You go back into the paperwork there, you can get a lot more information, and it's really quite interesting. Absolutely. Well, today I wanted to really talk about law firm partnerships, right? And so, I think the first place to start would be the three of the biggest mistakes that you see lawyers make when they're heading into a law partnership.
Yeah. So if I had to keep it to three, I think a big issue, you probably see this too, they're going in with rainbows and sunshines, and they're not really thinking about, is this really a good match or not? And so they don't sit down and have not the legal questions. That's different. I'm just talking about, what's the partnership going to look like? Are we right for each other? Where do you want to be in 5 years, 10 years? What is your skill set compared to mine? What role do you want to have in the partnership versus mine? If you have two of the same, you've seen this a lot too, probably, but if you have two of the same kind of person, that doesn't necessarily make for a good partnership. You really need people with two different skill sets or personalities even. And so that's a big thing. They don't really take the time to sit down and talk through some of these things on the front end. And a big part of this, I think, really for any law firm owner, but what's the vision for the firm? That's a big thing I tell my clients going in, is like, have y'all talked about what your vision is for the firm, for your life, and for your practice? Because that's a big cause, I think, of some of the breakups. Sure, money's involved, but it's really more of, I was hoping we build a firm where I could go to the beach 6 months out of the year, and the firm just sort of does this thing. And the other person says, no, I want the biggest firm in the world. That's not going to work. And so you need to know that on the front end.
Yeah. I call it the infatuation with the first date, right? So, it's, oh my God, that person's beautiful. I love them. They're fantastic. I should get married to them. And then they actually get married. It's like, well, no, wait a second. Let's have a few more dates before we figure this thing out, right? How many kids do you want? How are you with money? All of these really important things in life that frankly translate into the partnership realm, right? Because as you said, if we have a mismatch about where we're going, ain't nothing in the world going to fix that, right? So what's the next one?
And you're better off not even going down that path for sure, because it's going to be, you'd be better off not going down. Another one, I call it, the exit ramps. They don't think through the exit ramps. What's going to happen? Because every partnership is going to come to an end one way or the other. Hopefully, both till you retire, but it could be any sort of other way. So, a lot of times, particularly in the breakup cases I do, I was not involved in the making of the partnership agreement. If there was one, I guess that might add that to the list. There's a handshake versus a written agreement, but sometimes a handshake might be better than some of the written agreements I've seen.
Right.
And so the exit ramps, I think, is a huge part. Number one, be on the same page where you want to go. Number two, as you said, you call it the prenup. I call it the prenup for law firms. Build in the exit ramps. How do you do it? What happens? How do you notify clients? What do you do with the cases? What do you do with the assets? Who gets the space? All that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I mean, when you look at that from an exit ramp standpoint, everybody's focused on, somebody's going to die, right? Because that's what they all come in with. We know what we want on our buy-sell agreement. We know what we want on our partnership agreement. We're just going to insure each other, and then somebody dies, we're good. But it's the situation where, hey, I just don't want to be in business with you anymore, and I'm going to move off. And then in that case, we can't agree on anything, right? Because for lawyers in particular, it's all about personal goodwill. Right? I take my clients with me. You take your clients with me. Okay, well, who's going to take over the office space that is now an enormous liability because one of us left and they took half the team and all of that? So it's that focus. And as you know, we can't have non-competes. We can't have restrictive covenants, for lawyers. So really kind of figuring out the liability allocation is as important as trying to figure out where are the clients going to go, and who's the originator, but who gets to keep it because they're the primary attorney. Whatever happens there
can be a huge problem. I've definitely seen it on both sides. It's funny, sometimes nobody wants the space, and then sometimes both of them want the space. It's funny.
It depends. You see, it's always, if they like each other, that's one way, right? Oh, you can take the space. No, you take the space. If they hate each other, it's he wants a space, so I want the space.
Yeah. So maybe, I've got I got a long list, but maybe a third. For me, at least, I'm a big believer in not putting the compensation inside of a partnership agreement. You sort of put that to the side, because I think a compensation plan really is something that is meant to be able to be changed over time, because facts on the ground change and you may need to change it. But if it's inside the partnership agreement, then to change it, you got to crack open the whole thing. And then people want to start negotiating everything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, the comp plan is another factor that they never really consider, right? And all the variables and all of the flavors of different compensation plans really can make or break the relationship, right? And then a lot of people go in thinking, well, we're just going to be partners and, that 50-50 kind of sharing, which is just ridiculous. The other side of it is I don't think lawyers understand the idea of a profitable business and paying people fair market value, in particular owners, paying owners fair market value for the labor that they provide to the business, so that the business itself shows what the real profitability is of the business. When you're a solo, who cares? Right. But when you've got multiple owners, it's a huge issue.
You've seen this. We may have talked about this before, but the way most lawyers talk about firm profit, it's just they combine sort of what their fair market salary would be with just, profits, all this. So they put it all together and they say, we're, 60 to 70% profit margins. And it's like, no, that's not really the profit margins,
Right.
You know this very well. But
and then, so I've had people talk to me and, when we're looking at maybe selling their firm and they say 60%. And it's not possible to have a 60% profit margin unless, you're not paying anybody and you're working 100 hours a week, and who the heck's going to buy that? Because I'm going to buy a 100-hour a week job. I don't think so, but yeah, it's trying to get through to that point that says, hey, there are costs that have to be paid to produce this revenue. And while you can be frugal, there is a sliding scale, right? So there's the spendthrift on the one side, but on the other side, if you're too frugal, what ends up happening is you're not paying your people. You don't have the right space. You're not using the right resources. And that's going to negatively impact the firm in the long term anyway. So.
Yeah.
All right. So let's switch to, and maybe get in some of your mistakes on the opposite side here, but how to really create a successful law partnership.
So, again, some of the things we talked about, I think, making sure you're on the same page. The other thing I tell people, I think any partnership, really, it should be a 1 + 1 = 3. And what that means to me is it should be greater than the sum of the parts. So, we're bringing different skills to the table, and combined, we're going to be better than we would be, a multiple better than we would be on our own. And another part of that is, again, dividing up the roles. Everybody knows going in, and these things can change, but you sort of have an idea of what people are going to be doing and what the expectations are. And then, obviously you want to set up the governance, the voting, compensation, all that stuff. I think you need all of that in place. And some of these conversations can be difficult, but it's better to have them on the front end than the back end, because it will lay the foundation for a successful partnership going forward, I think.
Yeah, it's also important, I think, to make sure that they understand, typically they're friends. They know each other. So that's why they're deciding to go into partnership, right? And the expectation component is so important, because they don't want to upset one another with what they really want, because they think the other person doesn't necessarily want that. And when we sit down with them, and I'm sure you do the same thing, we're trying to create this environment where they can feel free to speak, so that all of this gets out on the table. And if we see somebody who's holding back, that's a huge red flag. We're going to nicely call them on it, because it's going to harm the overall relationship long term. And we know it will, because, that's the kind of person we see that then later on goes, I changed my mind. I don't like this anymore. And I want out.
I mean, you've seen it, I'm sure, but I've seen it where people come together and less than a year later, they're separating. I mean, that quick. I guess it's better to get out quick than later, maybe. I don't know. It just seems like you should have been able to sort of get to the bottom of that before. Although I'll say, I've heard plenty of stories of people. It's it's like having a roommate in college. You were best friends going in, but you'd never lived together, and you find out you're completely different. One's a slob and one's a clean freak. It's just, you're lucky if your friendship will survive at the end of the lease. Sometimes partnerships like that too, right?
I've done partnerships where people will come in and they'll say, we've been friends for 20 years. And I'm always saying to them, oh, no, don't do that. That is the worst possible thing. Not to be partners, but to think that because you are friends for 20 years, that somehow makes you more likely to remain partners than, everybody else that's out there. I think maybe it might actually work in inverse, because that relationship impacts the ability to set up the partnership properly at the front end.
And some of the most successful partnerships I've seen, they're friends in the sense that they were friendly and they respect each other, but they're not hanging out with each other, and their families didn't hang out together before the partnership and during the partnership. They sort of have their own separate lives outside of the firm. That seems to really work well.
Yeah. The key there is respect, right? I think that's the most important part. If you respect somebody, what you were talking about before, kind of the strategic decision of how does this work to both our benefits more than 1 + 1?
Yeah, respect. The other thing that I think is really important is sort of a default setting of, I want to be fair. Now, what that means, I guess, could be different things to different people. But if it's all about me, as opposed to us, or you, then it can break down pretty quick.
Yeah, that's one thing you got to be an observer on the outside for, because a narcissist is going to think they're being fair when it's all me. So.
You're probably right. Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we look at these things, ultimately it is the expectations, getting the expectations out on the table, figuring out how it's going to work day in and day out. I always have the conversation with them up front, and I'm sure you do too, that this is the purpose of this is a default mechanism. And if you guys decide in 2 years or 3 years you want to do something different, let's just modify the agreement. As long as you agree, we're good. But when you can't sit in the room with each other because you hate each other that much, this document is going to be your best friend.
That's a good point. I tell people that too. What we're putting in place here are the default rules. You can always agree to something different later. Even if you're separating and you say, we don't want to do what this says, we want to do something different, you can do that then. But if you can't agree, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
So,
yeah, no, it's an interesting conversation when you have everybody in the room together and really trying to make them put out what they really think, because that honeymoon first date kind of I'm on my best behavior component there really gets in the way. So I'd like to transition to ethical issues that come up in law partnerships. I know that you've seen a lot of them, so I'd love to hear some of those for our audience so they know not to do it.
Sure. Most states allow you to, technically you can practice in more than one firm at the same time. And there may be a situation where that makes sense, but generally no. And so some things I've seen is people are running some things on the side, They're not bringing it through the firm. And that's bad on so many levels. Obviously, that's money that should go in the partnership to be shared or whatever. It's an opportunity of the partnership. But you have sort of some of the risk issues. So if you're running something outside of the firm and the other person doesn't know about it, there's all sorts of risk that's out there that could be put onto the firm that there may not be coverage for. And so I've seen that. There's the classic, I'm going to be leaving. I'm leaving the firm. I've already decided I'm leaving, and I'm going to start basically telling all the clients before I tell the partner. That's another no. And that whether it happens or not, there's always an allegation that it happened. Every time. Like you went and told all the clients and got them lined up before you came to me. And sure, that happens. I mean, it does happen, but it seems like that allegation comes up every time.
It's always, digging for reasons why I did something or refused to do something is the way I look at it. It actually is interesting because, you don't have, well, maybe you do have this experience. When I get a call, because I only do transactional work, I don't do litigation work, right? So it's kind of an unnerving feeling when you get a call from a litigator who says, hey, I just got retained by Mr. Partner, and he is disputing it with Mr. Partner 2, and you wrote the agreement for them. And so I just wanted to talk to you about the agreement. It's a little bit unnerving because like, oh, wow. Is it as tight as I thought it was going to be?
That is a great question. You never know. I have seen I've made some very creative arguments, and you really can't see behind every corner. I mean, you really can't. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, my kind of viewpoint is when you're a transactional lawyer or you're acting in a transactional capacity, you're to some extent expected to see the future, right? To close up all the holes before somebody can find them. And then as a litigator, you're looking for any possible crack in the surface that you can just put a drill in and spread it out and get your client out of that agreement, right? And so we're at odds in the process there. So it's always, like I say, unnerving.
Yes. And I will say, my litigation practice has helped my drafting practice because without fail, every time I do another breakup, there's some new weird issue that I've never seen before that we now have to address. Like I had one a while back, the weirdest thing, it had to do with the Google business page. And this is nothing that would be taught in any case or anywhere. And unless you live through it, and I won't get into the boring part of it, but it was so technical and it was like, no one could have seen this coming. But nowadays in certain practices, that Google business page can be a huge issue. And then the question is, who owns that asset? Is that a Google asset or is it a firm asset? Right?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It seems to me like it's like the website URL or the telephone number.
You would think, but then Google comes in and says, I want to do these things. And Google says, no, you can't do that. We're not going to let you. It's against our rules. And they're like, your rules make no sense. And, so everything you've built is at the whim of Google. So yeah, I think it's a firm asset in a sense, but yes.
Yeah. And probably a firm contract right?
There you go.
More than anything else.
There you go.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you get into the situation of, stealing, quote unquote, stealing, right? Those firm assets and converting them over to your new firm's use or something like that, right? Imagine it's the same fight over the telephone number. It's the same fight over the collateral marketing material and the website and all of those things. So, and again, in a dissolution, the state law is going to govern what ultimately happens if you dissolve the firm, right? And if somebody's remaining behind, then those will all be the assets that are left behind. And good luck putting a value on them.
So let's talk about that. So I want to get your ideas. Here's an idea. It works in a two-person firm pretty easily. When you get beyond that, I've tried to do it in a bigger firm, but I can't quite crack the code. But what we've created is sort of an auction marketplace. So it's like, what's it worth? Well, what are you willing to pay? And then they bid against each other. And at some point you stop, and then that's right. What it is. But then if the person can't go through with it, then they get dinged and the other person gets it or something like that. So for like website or URL or phone number, that might be a way to do it.
Yeah.
Or another way is nobody gets it. But what approaches have you used?
Well, so I try to look at it in the context of the whole, right? Because if there's a dissolution, the assets then are technically sold, right? Or liquidated. And so in that case, you're going to have an auction because the highest and best bidder should get those assets. But internally, I like to use an auction process. I call it one cuts, one chooses, or shotgun, that kind of thing. And for those of the audience listening to it, so what typically happens in that approach, I call it one cuts, one chooses because think about having two kids and one piece of cake, right? So you tell the older child, go ahead and cut that piece of cake. And after you cut it, your younger sister gets to pick which side they want to have of the cake that's cut in half. And amazingly enough, the child becomes a brain surgeon and is able to cut that piece dead center. I mean, a laser measurement dead center. And so the same applies in the case of, I want to get out of business with you, but I don't want to dissolve the business. I just want you gone out of the business, right? And so in that scenario, if Jonathan and I Where in business, I would say, Jonathan, I'm making an offer to you to buy out your interest in the firm. And I could say to him, Jonathan, I'll pay you $1 million and I will pay you $100,000 a year for the next 10 years. Now, Jonathan then has one of two choices, only one of two choices. He can either turn that back around on me and buy my interest for $1 million payable $100,000 over 10 years, or he can accept my offer, one of those two things. But what it does is it forces me to be realistic in how I ultimately do that. So, I love that approach. It's not perfect, right? And I'm sure you've encountered this where one partner is more well-heeled than the other. And so they can maybe manipulate that a little bit. But it's better than having two people in a partnership that hate each other.
Yes. Or selling a pretty decent business on the courthouse steps, basically, for pennies
on the dollar.
Liquidation value.
Yeah. So no, I think the way I would do it in the case that you mentioned there is, you just do a written auction, right? So everybody has to submit their bids. There's one person, and then you're right. If that person fails to be able to follow through within some very short period of time, then at that point, that person is out, and then they also suffer some negative consequences in the liquidation proceeding as well. So maybe figure out damages. Yeah, no, I like that idea. That's a good idea, actually, when there is a dissolution going on. And really, that's going to come up when all the debts and obligations have been paid anyway. So, yeah. Let's see. Any other ethical conundrums that have come up?
Let me think. I'm sure part of what I do is, I advise folks if they're leaving or when folks have left. And the big thing is, again, telling the clients, telling the firm, at least in Georgia, I think probably pretty much everywhere, you can plan to leave. You just can't start competing until you've given notice and you've left. And so a big issue is when people start trying to compete, even if they don't have clients and they haven't taken clients. I've seen some instances where they're actually out there marketing their quote new firm before they're gone, and that's dangerous. The other thing I see a decent amount. You mentioned earlier no non-competes for lawyers, no restrictive covenants, period, really. And I guess there are some that would apply, but non-compete's the big one. And so most lawyers know that rule. Although some try to put something in there, most don't put it in there explicitly. They'll do these backdoor financial disincentives, I'll call them. And they'll say, well, if you leave, you get this. But if you leave and compete, you get half of that. And there's case law, pretty much the majority rule at least, that says, no, that's really a non-compete and we're not going to enforce it. So it's really not even worth putting in there.
You mentioned two situations where to transfer the file, there's a prohibitive fee that's due the law firm, and that effectively has been determined to be a non-compete agreement or something akin to it.
That is a big issue. So whenever lawyers are breaking apart, they are mad at each other, but they've got to remember the ethical rules that we all are supposed to abide by. The client's interests are paramount. Our duties to the client take, the first chair over everything else. And so our fight cannot negatively affect them. And so if I'm mad at you and the client says they want to go with you, I cannot say, no, you don't get your file, because then that'll adversely affect the client. And so that happens quite a bit. And vice versa. A client hasn't said, I'm just taking the file, so I've got it. That's, got to be careful there. And then, some of the other, these are sort of detailed nuts and bolts. But, if you've got client funds in escrow or in your trust account, you better be sure you get a written direction from the client saying, send it over to this place. You don't want to do it without the client saying that, because then everybody could get in trouble.
Yeah. Yep.
Big trouble.
Yeah. I wonder how many breakups that you've been involved in have resulted in bar action against one or more of the involved attorneys?
None to date. Knock on wood.
That's
hopefully
fantastic.
It stays that way. It's always a topic. Should we file a bar complaint? It's always a topic. But, look, if somebody has been stealing client money, I think that that needs to be taken to the bar, because that's
Florida, we would have an obligation to notify the bar in that case.
Exactly. That is a threat to the public. But my sense is that most bar regulators, when two lawyers are fighting, they just think it's a civil thing, and they don't want to get in the middle of it. And there are going to be allegations all over the place, and they're not going to know how to sort through it. But maybe on the back end, it could come up. But everyone always asks, should we go file a bar complaint? I won't say always, but a lot of times I'm like, don't do it. It's just not even worth it.
Yeah. No, I can only imagine if you do that, you're getting one coming right back at you. That's what's going to happen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So then you're going to have to deal with that in addition to the breakup. Not a good place to be in. Well, Jonathan, I really appreciate you taking the time with me to talk about law partnerships and the ethical issues involved. Tell the audience how people can get in touch with you if you have the questions or need additional information.
Sure. So the firm's called Law Firm GC. The URL is yourlawfirmgc.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Come find me there. Send me a connection request. I'll accept it. I've got a podcast too called Founding Partner Podcast, and find me there. But yeah, just check out my website. LinkedIn is where I spend a lot of time. That's probably a good spot to come find me.
You definitely spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, and we'll tell you, I love your podcast. So great job on that. That's wonderful. I appreciate you being on, and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks, Ed. I've enjoyed it.